Arctic Mike, can you mute yourself when you're not talking?
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's coffee chat. Again, sorry for the delay. We've had more issues than normal today. Normally, we use Jitsi in order to directly live stream. Instead, today we are simply talking on Jitsi, screen capturing the discussion, and then live streaming that. So it's a much more involved process here. So we so appreciate you all joining us and working with us as we continue with this. I'm still trying to make sure it's working. Hopefully, it looks like it's sort of working. Okay, so just quick introductions. And again, I apologize. If there are issues with volume, let me know so I can try and bump and adjust it slightly. But we'll probably have a few issues throughout today, unfortunately. So quick introductions. So my name is Justin. I'm not pictured because to save CPU, my webcam's off. But I'm the organizer of the Monero Community Work Group, and we help put these on every so often, well, about once a month. Arctic Mine, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Francisco. And I'm a, sorry, am I getting an echo here?
Yes.
Because something's delaying it.
Well, that's better.
Okay.
Might have been me.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I see what the problem is now. Okay, good. My name is Francisco, and of course, I'm involved in the Monero project and on the code team. I guess most people know me around from posting, so we can go from there.
Okay, thanks, Arctic Mine. All right, next, Howard, can you please introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm HYC, and I've been, well, originally I was working just on the blockchain database in Monero, but lately I've just been working randomly all over the code, and most recently looking at the proof of work algorithms.
Awesome, thanks, Howard. I know we had a few questions come in before, and I think it would be really helpful if we were able to cover some of those today. So thanks for seeing you on again today. Diego, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi guys, my name is Diego. A man that needs no introduction because I just introduced myself. So I do like what do I do in this place? I do website stuff. I'm working on the new foreign funding system. I try to sell high while we're all very sad, and I run cyphermarket.com where you can purchase shirts. Yay, that's me.
Excellent. Is Sarang still here? Maybe, maybe not. Okay.
He got fed up.
Sarang left. Okay, who else is in the chat? We have two people that are labeled as fellow Jitsers. I think one of them is HYC. If you're the other person, please speak up.
This is Doug.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me? Doug Chabonga Man, the host of the Monero Talk Show. Yeah, I see a lot of smart, intelligent speakers on today, so I will try to refrain from speaking as much as possible. But thanks for having me on.
No, we're happy to have you on, Doug. I actually want to start with you first. So you recently, I believe it was yesterday, had an interview with Andrew Poelstra, who worked for Blockstream and has contributed a lot to the Mimblewimble protocol. Can you sort of summarize that interview for us here? What were some of the key takeaways that you felt you got out of that interview, and overall, how was it having Andrew on your show?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys got to tune in, but we actually ended up not speaking about Mimblewimble at all, which is okay. My key takeaway was, well, I mean, the biggest question I left with, or the question that was posed, was basically this this meme that's been going around of whether or not you could have a coin that's perfectly fungible and private,
while also knowing and relying upon the fact that there's no secret inflation that could potentially happen in the background. So I was surprised to hear that from Andrew. I've heard that from others in the Bitcoin community, but Andrew went so far to say that he, really sees that as, I guess, a risk in Monero, and even saying that the fear being that quantum computing may be, I don't know, he didn't go into the details of when he sees it becoming an issue, but he actually does see it as a potential issue, that something like quantum computing can break the discrete logarithm that Monero relies upon and Bitcoin relies upon, but in Monero, it being a much larger issue in that it could potentially be secretly inflated. So this all ties to, I guess, why the reasoning as to why Bitcoin has hesitated to upgrade and become more fungible and private using things like confidential transactions, because of this reasoning that they want to wait for something where they can rely on the fact that the secret inflation can happen. So I would love to hear everybody. I think I've spoken to Howard about this a little bit when he came on the show. I have my own personal opinion on it, in that I think privacy and fungibility is so vital to what cryptocurrency is supposed to be, that it should be, we should be looking to be on the bleeding edge of whatever it needs to be to have it, because without it, the value proposition of cryptocurrency itself really starts to fall apart in my eyes. But I would love to hear everybody else's input on it. And that was really kind of my main takeaway from Andrew's talk yesterday.
Yeah, excellent. We definitely appreciate you having those conversations. They're generally very helpful for, I think, the Monero community to hear some of these perspectives that you take the time for people to discuss within the Monero community, when you have people like Sarang on to discuss some of the recent research developments, but also good to speak with people who are usually outside of the Monero ecosystem and might interact in some way, like Andrew Poelstra. I think actually the first time I learned about Monero when I was researching these things, I believe was a direct result of a Stack Exchange post from Andrew Poelstra, who was talking about ring signatures. So I think I mostly have him to thank, at least initially, from learning about Monero in the first place. Sort of in a long time ago sort of situation. But I definitely think that'd be good to open up to discussion, sort of the trade-off that Monero generally makes, that we sacrifice soundness, we sacrifice the ability for people to immediately see the amount of outstanding Monero in circulation, and we put the trust in the mathematical implementation of confidential transactions in order to have a lot of the privacy benefits that we have today. Do we think, what is sort of the reason that we do that trade-off with Monero, and do we ever see Bitcoin making a sort of similar trade-off ever going forward? Arctic Mind, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, my thought here is that one of the major trade-offs, which really wasn't covered, is transaction cost.
You're pretty quiet, man. Is he quiet for everyone else?
Sorry?
You're pretty quiet for me.
Okay, I did turn it down quite a bit. Is this better?
I mean, yeah, I guess so. A little bit better.
Yeah. Okay. I'll raise the sound a bit. Second. There we go.
Just.
Is that better?
That's a lot
Yeah,
better.
perfect.
Okay. Good. Okay, well, my thought is that yes, there is a technical trade-off in soundness, but I think more directly, there's also a transaction size trade-off with privacy and confidentiality in Bitcoin that Monero doesn't have because of the adaptive block size limit. But if you were to take and say make the transaction size of a Bitcoin transaction 4 times bigger and leave the block size the same, then that's 4 times fewer transactions on the chain. And they're already overloaded. So I think that's going to be the sort of immediate limitation, as opposed to even if we have a more sound technical solution that say people can trust that what we have right now, Bitcoin is still going to be limited.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways here is that everything is very intertwined. And you might say, well, we're discussing this and not this, or this and not this. But the issue is, like, all of these things have to work together. All these things have to fit together like a puzzle. And so, talking about it's difficult to separate the privacy and inflation problem from the scaling problem. In fact, I would say it's impossible to separate those two, because if you implement, it's like Arctic Mind said, it's just completely off the table at the moment for Bitcoin to even to attempt to do something like that because of how overloaded they are, even if they wanted to. So, blockchain is just so interdependent on a whole bunch of different stuff working masterfully and perfectly together. And if it doesn't, everything just falls apart. And this is what makes it so difficult to get right. And this is what makes all the projects that go around oh, well, we figured this out, and they just kind of throw a few ideas together. It's it doesn't work that way. All this stuff has to work together extremely well. Otherwise, it just all falls apart on itself.
So I know that so scalability is generally an issue with privacy that we brought up, and at the moment we have the sort of difficulty in getting soundness with privacy too. In relation to Bitcoin, which one do you think is a bigger problem? Suppose that we were able to magically snap our fingers and make a privacy solution that was either more efficient than the Bitcoin solution, or as sound, or somehow more sound than what Bitcoin is, but still have privacy. If we were able to have either extreme, which one do you think would be more likely to be adopted in Bitcoin? And this can be open. And this can be open to anyone. Arctic Mind, if you want to take it again.
I guess if we made the private transaction smaller than the clear transaction, that's essentially what you're saying, then of course the limitation of scalability is in there. I really have questioned how feasible that is. Maybe there is a technology that does that. But yeah, in case that will be the case. Otherwise, I still think that scalability really right now, I don't think Bitcoin could accept anything makes it even that larger transaction-wise. But that's about the scenario. You have to make the transaction smaller.
Okay, thanks, Arctic Mind. So I think now we're going to move on to.
Well, can I speak real quick on something?
Yeah, go ahead, Diego.
Quite Bitcoin related that I think is talked about enough, and I think is actually quite scary. I am against, and this is going to be a very shocking statement maybe to some people watching. I am very against Bitcoin being mass adopted, and I think it, in its current state, it allows for an unprecedented level of surveillance on people's finances, and always the people who suffer the worst are the people that are disenfranchised, the people on the fringes of this type of thing. It really just opens up, so to speak, all the bank accounts to any government that wants to look at it. And you don't even have to be in the same country, as long as you have access to certain amounts of metadata. And we just don't know who's collecting what at what time. We just have to assume that they're pretty much collecting everything all the time. I would fight tooth and nail for Bitcoin or any of its derivatives to be adopted on a massive scale. It allows too much power to the people who have the disproportionate ability to surveil a network, the whole internet network. I think it's a very dangerous tool. I think it's very stupid. And I think it's something that's not talked about enough, just the level of power that Bitcoin gives people that are already in power. And something like Monero is, or, I mean, heck, God forbid, you know, sorry to offend anybody here, but like if Zcash ever figures out their trusted setup thing and like, you know, starts to go private by default, anything like that is 1,000 times more preferable. Anything with any privacy aspects is 1,000 times more preferable than Bitcoin in its current state. Bitcoin is dangerous in its current state, and it should not be mass adopted. It will be used for evil things, not just in like, and I don't mean in terms of you know, purchasing illicit stuff. I'm talking about in terms of oppression by the powers that be. It will be used for these things, and we are very naive and stupid to think otherwise.
Okay, I'm going to just briefly comment on that. The threat is Dogecoin, not Bitcoin. And the reason is Dogecoin has a tail emission, and you could put Monero's scaling technology on it. In Bitcoin, you can't really do it.
Got it. All right. So Dogecoin.
No, but I just real quick. I mean, Diego, I agree with you, and I think the scariest part is that it's marketed as the opposite. I mean, you know, it comes from this cypherpunk crypto anarchist movement, and it's kind of got this. The way it's marketed is that it's, you know, it is kind of the great equalizer, and it's going to, you know, bring liberty and freedom to all, when it's kind of, the opposite is possible here, as people are opting into this thing, not realizing that it may create the opposite scenario in the future, more of a dystopia than a utopia. And it is a little bit scary, and I think that's why, you know, it's important for Monero to charge ahead and to also try to, you know, get the information out there. I don't think, you know, only now are people starting to realize, first of all, how transparent Bitcoin actually is, and I don't think anybody really realizes what that means, what the implications are.
Yeah,
and I very much realize that my view is fairly extreme. So,
what's that?
I said I very much realize that my view is fairly extreme. Just for anyone watching who's fairly shocked. I've mentioned this before to quite some pushback.
Yeah, in my opinion, I think we're so used to a fungible system without realizing what it is, and people are used. It's an assumption people make in their everyday transactions that they do not need to worry about Class B coins, Class C coins being worth less. And if Bitcoin's widely adopted, these are going to be essentially new problems we're going to have to face again. And people aren't going to think about them until it sort of becomes a huge catastrophe. Or everyone will just use a point of sale service that audits the incoming funds and makes sure they're Class A coins or something. I don't know. We'll go right back to the same sort of payment processor system we have today, in my opinion. But instead of actually settling the transaction, they'll audit for you to make sure the funds are not tainted or have some lower value.
But there's, I mean, if there's a little bit of time, there's another thing that has recently come up in the past couple of weeks that I would like to discuss specifically regarding fungibility. If that's okay, and if we didn't have anything else to do. Something else you wanted to do, Justin?
Just putting some things on the agenda. We have two things we really still need to cover. We had a question come in about Lightning Network, so we can get to that when we have time. And then I wanted to speak with Howard about RandomX and RandomJS, because that's pretty interesting.
Okay.
So you can go ahead with your fungibility question, and then we can move on to those.
Okay, great. So I was having a discussion on Reddit, which is an awful place. I was having a discussion on Reddit with somebody regarding fungibility, and he very much disagreed. And after looking in depth into what he said, I can only see that he is correct. And so I'm gonna talk about this with the Monero community. We often use interchangeably the words interchangeable and indistinguishable. Meaning when we define fungibility, we say fungibility is making making sure that two pieces of the same unit of currency are indistinguishable from another. And sometimes we say interchangeable. Fungibility's technical definition from an economic viewpoint, and I read several economic papers written by different universities and stuff, and most of them actually don't define it. Most of them define it as money has no labels. This idea that money has no labels, and I can expand on that in just a second. But it's not indistinguishable. It is interchangeable, and there is a subtle difference there, in that if something is and I guess the best way to explain it was the example that I read there is like if somebody gets $50 like from a lottery ticket versus gets $5,000 windfall somehow, obviously those dollars are all dollars and they don't have labels like this is short-term money or this is long-term money. But people, with the $50 will kind of mentally put it in short-term money. They're more likely to spend it right away. Whereas if they get $5,000, that is kind of wealth in their mind, and so they're more likely to save it or put it towards something that increases their wealth, like maybe a house payment or something like that. But the money itself doesn't have any labels. The money itself is fairly interchangeable. And so from this strictest technical definition, Bitcoin would be fungible because Bitcoin does not have any labels. It's just that intrinsically and technically, it has no labels on its own. It's just that humans put labels on it like dirty, tainted, that type of thing. That said, a lot of the papers that I have looked at did make a distinction, without calling it out necessarily by name, about practical functional fungibility, as in what humans consider fungible, and what is actually strictly technically fungible. And it was a very subtle concept to grasp, and it was a little bit difficult at first, but after a few examples, I was able to wrap my mind around it. But there's a very interesting distinction there, because when we go around and saying like fungibility is kind of the indistinguishability of two different things, that's not necessarily correct. And I'm actually planning, I'm setting up a meeting with a local economy professor at the university that's close to my place, just to kind of discuss this with him, get a little bit of a better idea from an economist viewpoint. And I don't know. To me, like I like to be right, and I like to be correct in the things that I'm saying. So I'm still kind of working through this in terms of kind of coming to an understanding about functional fungibility, because we all know, especially coders and developers like HYC, code is only as good as the humans that are using it, and like it has to be human usable. It's made for humans to do stuff. If humans can't do stuff with it, like or for the benefit of humanity, like what's the point of it? But that's the whole reason we're in Monero, because we want to benefit humanity in terms of we think privacy should be a thing. So I don't know, I guess I'm just kind of throwing that out there, maybe not necessarily for discussion, but just kind of for pondering. Because when I did start looking through a lot of the Monero resources, there was that word indistinguishable showing up a lot. And it's not necessarily correct. And so I'm delving a little further into this, and I'm open to being wrong in this area. Which I want to brag on the Monero community about. That's one thing that kept me around here, is people were open to being kind of incorrect and being updated on their stuff. So anyway, so I just want to throw that just kind of an aside. Anyway, yeah, I still hold that Bitcoin is not functionally or humanly fungible, but it is technically fungible, which is the worst kind of correct. The technically correct.
I think it sort of comes back to what you say, how it matters how humans interact with it. So if people never looked at the history of Bitcoin transactions for any reason, suppose no one knew how, let's say. Suppose we had this magical Bitcoin pool that no one bothered checking or verifying or anything else, it just worked. If that was the case, then Bitcoin would be functionally fungible, but I think that once you start adding some real-life assumptions, such as people can do that, regulatory pressures encourage people to do that, then we can start to say that, okay, distinguishability starts to become a factor in determining whether or not they can be exchanged one-to-one or another set of circumstances. So I think it really depends on... I think it depends on what set of assumptions you introduce and start with, because once you start adding real-life assumptions, I think we can start breaking down the sort of what fungibility means in practice. Like yeah, what fungibility means in practice. Like if you, with Bitcoin, make the assumption that before everyone sends and receives funds, that they go through, let's say, a really methodical, well thought out mixing process before and after receiving funds, you could maybe argue that Bitcoin's pretty fungible too. So like, it depends on how you sort of define the level of fungibility. I personally feel that you sort of need to look at what the general actual use of the cryptocurrency is, what the state of the sort of regulatory environment is, and how people interact with it. And I think that ultimately when you do that, I think our marketing is really about in the right place right now, where, I mean, you're right, Monero is not perfectly fungible either. If you go to the other extreme, it's fungible by plausible deniability, right? Not perfect untraceability. So it's close, but not perfect. And likewise, Bitcoin is fungible if you make all these assumptions that people don't do, but they really do these in real life. So I think it might be a more loose thing than we normally let on. But I think that in general, you just look to see what is the general ability of changeability based off how people usually use it. I think is the best way to really look at fungibility generally.
Right. Go for it, Asians.
I think you're kind of nitpicking, and Justin got to most of the point. The thing is, when you have physical tokens and you can make them fungible, all right, they really are indistinguishable. Like a physical coin doesn't have a serial number on it. Okay. Printed notes that do have serial numbers actually are distinguishable, and the only reason they are fungible is by law, right? That's the whole principle behind fiat. So when we're talking about digital tokens, these things all have signatures on them. So of course they are all identifiable. They're all uniquely identifiable, right? So it's vital that their identifying features are practically meaningless. It's vital to make them indistinguishable, because we don't have a law that forces you to accept them. So yeah, indistinguishability is a fundamental requirement.
Correct. Yes, and I completely agree. And I would say that an otherwise technically fungible asset, when treated as non-fungible, as Bitcoin is, becomes, for all practical purposes, not fungible. And I understand that it doesn't make a good marketing tagline. So rather than explain all of that to a person, it's easier just to say, and actually technically correct. Well, not technically correct, but practically correct, that Bitcoin is not fungible. And I completely agree that origin and distinguishability play the most massive role in humans treating something as fungible or non-fungible. And that's actually mentioned in several of the economic papers that I've read as well. So anyway, yeah, sorry for the aside.
Yeah, Diego, I look forward to hearing what you speak with your professor, that you're speaking with at your local university, and we can resume these talks. I think it would be cool if you have a post written up about it, and I think that'd be cool to speak later to the Monero outreach team to see sort of what their recommendations are. Howard, I think now is a good time to move on to sort of the state of RandomJS and RandomX. We had a few questions come in. I admittedly have not been following either extremely closely, mostly because I don't have the required skill set to contribute. However, I know that initially you started working on RandomJS, and now you are working a little more closely with RandomX, although you still have reservations. So, can you speak a little bit about the ideas behind RandomJS and RandomX, what the differences are, and what sort of the pros and cons that you're looking at the moment are?
Sure. I mean, they both start from the same basic idea, which is we want to use randomly generated code for our proof of work algorithm so that anyone who wants to develop special purpose hardware for proof of work will be forced to implement a full-blown CPU, right? As opposed to the very simple circuits that they do for like SHA-256 or whatever else you want to talk about. So that's the main goal, right? We want randomly generated code, and we want to force you to execute that code on a CPU. And that's our way of leveling the playing field between the ASIC guys and, you know, desktop computers, GPU users, whatever. You know, everybody is going to be running a proof of work algorithm that requires an instruction set processor of some kind. Right? That's the basic goal. So with random.js, the idea was, you know, we would generate random JavaScript source code and have that be executed as the proof of work. And there's a couple of problems with that approach, which is why we've abandoned it. First of all, you know, JavaScript itself is a fairly complex language. That's actually one of the reasons I chose it in the first place, but that works against us because it makes it very difficult to validate or audit an implementation and say, yea, verily, this implementation is sound and correct and behaves as expected. The complexity is just too great, so we can't actually, you know, successfully audit that. Right? So that's one problem. And, you know, that problem is enough to disqualify it. The other problem is you can't actually force a hardware implementer to execute the JavaScript code after you generate it. You know, there's all kinds of shortcuts you could take, and obviously, you know, in a performance-sensitive application like this, any shortcut that exists will get taken, right? So after you've generated the source code, your internal representation of that source code is actually a more efficient representation than the JavaScript code itself. And so a hardware implementer could just take that internal representation and execute it much more efficiently than if they went all the way through a JavaScript interpreter. And there's no way to prevent that from happening. So that's a massive weakness in the approach. And so, yeah, those are the main two reasons why we said, hey, you know, this random.js isn't going to work. So the idea now with RandomX is basically we get rid of the programming language completely, right? So there is no actual representation of the program or any control flow. Basically, RandomX says any 16-bit pattern is a valid computer instruction. And so we just generate 8 kilobytes of random data and start treating it as instruction code. So RandomX defines its own virtual machine, basically. It defines a type of a CPU, a virtual CPU that knows how to, you know, take in 16 bits at a time and treat them as instruction words and goes to town on that. That's the basic idea.
Excellent. That gives a lot of good perspective. I was curious where the name, where the letter X came from. So X is basically the absence of a programming language.
Yeah.
So what are you said that you had some general reservations about moving to RandomX. You think it generally is a more proper way forward than random.js for the reasons you mentioned. What are some of the big reservations and challenges that you still need to overcome with RandomX?
Personally, I think that RandomX virtual machine is simple enough that it could be implemented very easily. Like, you know, you could take a very small CPU core, like the size of a very small ARM processor, and put 1,000 of these onto a mining chip. Yeah. But just tossing out fake numbers there. But so that's my one reservation about it, is that the specification is still very simple and probably very easy to implement in hardware. That's something that, you know, we really aren't going to know for sure until we're further along in the development of the software and we see how heavily we can optimize the software.
Excellent. So how long has have the contributors been working on RandomX?
Tevador started that project, and it's been going for a couple of months. And we've been reviewing it on IRC and on GitHub, and Tevador's been collecting benchmark results. So we've been testing across a variety of different CPUs, Intel, AMD, and ARM, to get an idea of how fast typical arithmetic instructions execute. And
all hell has broken loose. So.
Massive feedback. All right, so we've basically been using that to tune the instruction mix. All right, basically, you're taking a random bit pattern in and saying this is a valid instruction. We're allocating the range of bits differently to the different instruction types. So this basically gives a weighting factor to how frequently a particular type of instruction will appear and how frequently it will be executed. The main reason that we needed to look at this is we're using both integer and floating point instructions, and typically floating point is much slower than integer. We're doing arithmetic, logical operators, Boolean operators, whatever. Add, subtract is easy. You can do that in a single cycle. Multiply is a little bit harder. You could do that in maybe 3 cycles, whatever. Integer divide is even harder and typically runs in a variable length of time, depending on what the 2 operands are. So, we needed to collect these kinds of performance statistics to give us an idea of what proportion of instructions should be a particular type of operation, because we want the total execution time to be, nearly constant.
Excellent. Thanks, Howard. So if someone wants to follow this project more closely going forward, how would you recommend someone do that?
Well, they should definitely look at Tevador's repo on GitHub. It's Tevador/RandomX. And if they want to, join in on the real-time discussions, join us on the Monero-POW channel on IRC.
Monero-POW? P-A-L?
P-O-W, yeah.
Oh, P-O-W, okay. We should have Monero PAL for finding pals in Monero,
Yeah, whenever you need a friend in the Monero community. Well, you can always go to Monero-community if you need a friend in the Monero community. But,
those jokers don't do anything.
Excellent. So did we have, I see we have a few more names in chat. Does anyone else want to introduce themselves before we move on to the last few questions here?
Hey, this is Miss from Nonsense Research Lab, and I lurk around MRL a lot of the time. Do a lot of stuff with Insight, Decentralized Consensus Lab as well. Super excited to be dropping in here late. Sorry about the delay. Schedule didn't permit catching the whole meeting.
Yeah, great to see a face to the name, Isthmus. It's nice to have you on. I'm glad you can make this one. Make sure to join in if you have any sort of conversation you want to add during the last coffee chat here, during the coffee chat here. So the one question we had come in today from a viewer said, is Lightning Network a good or bad solution to Monero scaling? Maybe on-chain transactions are not needed for buying groceries, etc. So this is sort of the same sort of question that we often get around Lightning Network and sort of what general trade-offs there are, and if Monero is open to pursuing the Lightning Network implementation. So Arctic Mine, do you have a further explanation on what sort of thought processes have been going around regarding Lightning Network and Monero and sort of the talks that we've had there?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that Lightning Network itself is definitely, you can definitely do it on Monero, and it has very valid uses. I've always been a skeptic of Lightning Network as a scaling tool, as opposed to like let me give you a scenario of something where I think Lightning Network will be quite useful. Let's say you're making a series of payments to somebody. Let's say a utility company or a VPN or whatever. You're paying them once a month, and you want to have. You could use Lightning Network to do that. Even in a more extreme example, you would open the channel and then you could transfer the money at the appropriate points in time. That's very useful in that situation. In a situation is, let's say you are a regular customer of a coffee shop, called the Starbucks card model. You, instead of depositing money with them in a sort of in a trusted central ledger, you could put the money you could use something like Lightning Network to do that. And then every cup of coffee, you just basically transfer it and then you close off the channel at the end. So those kind of applications, I think it has a lot of sense. It makes sense for Monero. In some cases, it might even help with privacy in Monero, because if you have multiple separate transactions between two parties, that's attackable, or that's potentially attackable. What I don't see Lightning Network doing is replacing on-chain scaling, which is how to be marketed in Bitcoin. And I think that's really a lot of the problems with that. I don't see that as a viable, really long-term solution as a replacement, but I think it has its places in Monero. And it really comes down to the step-by-step implementation of the infrastructure on the main chain to support something like that that's been happening. So yeah, that's kind of how I see the whole thing. I mean, I've never seen it as a solution. I think it's going to be a bit of a reckoning in Bitcoin where people are going to realize the Lightning Network doesn't really solve the problems they think it solves. Especially the biggest problem that I have with Lightning Network in Bitcoin is if you have too many channels, how do you close them? I mean, if your main chain is overloaded, they can't close the channels. Well, how's that gonna? What impact is that gonna have on Lightning Network? Is it gonna destabilize the whole thing? Those are real serious problems when it comes to scaling a Lightning Network. That I don't think really people are asking those questions. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Okay, does anyone else have thoughts on Lightning Network and Monero? A lot of quietness there. So someone...
Justin, it's Doug from Monero Talk. A question I've posed to you guys before, some of you guys, just the idea that maybe even Lightning is a better fit for Monero versus Bitcoin, given the architecture of Monero, the fact that we have the tail emission, because the idea if Lightning is running on Bitcoin and most of the transactions now move to the second layer, what is then the incentive for miners to mine? Whereas on Monero, that incentive to mine obviously always exists with the tail emission. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
So I mean, I believe I mentioned this when you interviewed me, and I think I talked about Arctic Line's relation too. In my opinion, Monero bodes itself better to second layer solutions than other cryptocurrency projects, precisely because on the main layer, there's very limited information that's leaked. So if you're interacting between Monero and some other second layer solution, let's take a private solution, for example. Suppose you had a ZK Snark sidechain on top of Monero, which is like one of the long-term, really cool possible goals we could eventually have. In that case, then it would be, Monero is perfect for that compared to Bitcoin, because when you're transacting between Monero and the sidechain, you're not leaking the amount when you're going back and forth. You're not leaking what address it comes from when you go back and forth. You could use the same wallet when going back and forth. You don't have to go through a long process of complicated ways in order to generate new accounts and making sure they never touch each other and other sort of circumstances. And even if you're making a system that isn't privacy focused, you can build it with the knowledge that information isn't leaked on the Monero chain, at least to a significant extent, especially compared to transparent solutions. In regards to, I think, your more specific argument, or your more specific question, which is for people's general concern that with Bitcoin, if you have most people use Lightning Network, that there won't be enough on-chain transaction volume to sustain a strong, secure mining network. I think that would be a better question for ArcticMine to answer, because he has a more in-depth view on Monero's tail emission and other situations like that. Could you speak up about that, ArcticMine?
Yes, I'll take that question, and I think it's important to look at it. I mean, there's two potential problems, and my thought about it is that, and it was asked to me, I think, in one of the talks, and I gave it a bit of a bit more thought about that question. And to me, the issue in Bitcoin, it's not going to be that there's not going to be mining incentives because everybody's moved on to Lightning Network. You still have to close the channels. The problem is you won't be able to close the channels. So my concern there is that in Monero, of course, you can scale and close the channels, and the Lightning Network is stable. In a situation like Bitcoin, there's a real danger, not that you don't incentivize the miners, because you've got this 1 megabyte block and it's still going to be filled, instead of with individual transactions, maybe not with people closing channels on Lightning Network, basically. That's kind of what I can see happening there. The real danger is going to be that the channels won't close. Now, the question, on the other hand, is very relevant if you're looking at, say, Bitcoin Cash or the new Bitcoin Satoshi Vision. They're really vulnerable to that type of failure, in the sense that they're making the block sizes very, very big, and they keep making them bigger and bigger. In that situation, you will be definitely vulnerable to that failure. Although in principle, you can also be vulnerable to that failure without Lightning Network. Then simply there isn't the incentives for the miners to raise the fees. So that's where I see the biggest problem. So I think it is. I do agree that Monero is way more suitable for Lightning Network than Bitcoin is. But I would argue that I think with Lightning Network, the bigger problem in Bitcoin is going to be not being able to close channels, as opposed to not having enough of a miner incentive for the miners, because you still have that 1 megabyte limit, and well, it's now slightly bigger because of SegWit, but you still have that limit on the block size, and that's basically where it could destabilize the Lightning Network, in my opinion. So,
thank you.
Okay, so that answered your question?
Yeah, I had asked Arctic that as well on the show. I'm sorry to repeat the question, but I'm glad he gave it more thought, and maybe we have some additional viewers here, so it's nice that people are learning this information.
Excellent. So we're nearing the last few minutes of the chat here. So if anyone here has any questions for anyone available in chat, make sure you speak up now. We're all open to ask questions. That's kind of why we're here. Answer questions. That's kind of why we're here. And if you are watching this on YouTube, make sure you leave a chat and with some questions. So hopefully we are able to get to those too in the last few minutes here. Does anyone? I know Isthmus, you just showed up. Do you have a question for anyone here?
I'll hold my questions for now.
All right, great. Let's see. So
wait, I do. So Monero uses block lock time, I think, by default. Was that selected empirically or arbitrarily? Because one of the things I'm probably going to do soon is look at the historical reorganization depths and just plot a histogram and see like what is our like median or mean reorg depth, and then like does what the distribution that we see actually suggest that 20 is like the safest number, or should we adjust that? But so I'm just wondering where the 20 came from in the first place.
That's an excellent question. I do not personally know the answer to. Howard or ArcticMine, do you know the answer to this, or does this need to be a question for Monero Research Lab?
We should ask Thankful for today. Oh, no, he was doing one of the block times. That's what he wanted.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Whether the 20 block lock time that Monero uses was a data-driven choice or just kind of like arbitrarily selected. And the question I'm asking is, I'm gonna go look at the data anyways. So I'll post the results to this in Monero Research Lab when I have a chance in the next week or two. I just haven't plotted. I haven't had a chance to do the data dump and plot yet.
It's 10 block unlock time, is it not?
Sorry, 20 minutes, 10 blocks. My bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, that limit's been there for a long time. I think if you were to ask Smooth, he'd probably give you an explanation.
Cool. Thanks.
Yes, I would concur with that. What the historical reason for that is, because it's very well, it could have been just chosen, sort of in a semi-arbitrary way. A lot of these parameters, if they work, they don't get changed. But it's definitely worth looking at, I think, from a research perspective, to identify what is the optimal numbers that should be used in this perspective. Like basically getting empirical data for reorganizations and so on and so forth, and seeing what the probabilities are, and then going from there. It's definitely worth looking at.
Yeah, good question. I wish, unfortunately, Sarang and Sure were not able to make it today. They're off and on though, but I'm sure you can speak with them some other time, and I'm sure you already frequently speak with them for a variety of other things you're working on.
Pretty much daily.
All right. So we don't seem to have any last minute questions coming in through YouTube here. So any last questions here, or should we wrap it up? Last chance.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just want to shill Monero Talk for 1 second, just because we recently just launched our website. It's monerotalk.live. So if anybody wants to go check that out, that's watching, it's a way to find all our shows, and we also put them in podcast form, so now people can listen to them. And thanks again for having me on.
Oh gosh, that reminds me, I should put in a plug that very soon Mastering Monero will be available as a free book for covering everything from like, why do you want to use Monero, how to use Monero, to all the technical stuff. Serhack is the author. We're in the final stages of editing that under my Uncaged Potential handle. And yeah, be excited. That should be coming out very soon. We'll have free copies and hard copies available. Justin has been like amazingly helpful with this whole process, and I'm really excited to share that with the community.
Are we plugging stuff now? Is that what we're doing? I have 1,000 things to plug.
We're plugging free stuff.
Yeah, I know Mastering Monero is right about so close. So hopefully people can still get it around Christmas time. That was the original hope with the large push here. All right. So without further ado, again, thank you everyone for coming to join us. I know today was far less than ideal for this sort of circumstances to get Jitsi hosted and everything. Hopefully we will not have these issues in the future. This is actually the first time we've had issues in quite a long time. So again, hopefully we can mitigate them going forward. But we made it through it, and I hope that all the viewers really got a lot out of this. I know it was really interesting to learn about RandomX. I know it was great to listen to the Monero Talk interview with Andrew Polstra, so make sure you go see that if you haven't already. One last tiny plug I want to make. So Sarang and I, and possibly Sure if he's available, are starting a series called Breaking Monero. We will be going through all of the, or not all of, many of the privacy and security implications of Monero, and doing about 15-ish minute videos breaking down how it affects people. And those will be available on YouTube. We're recording our first video, which is an introduction to everything, next week. So expect this week. It's already Saturday. So this coming up week. So expect a Reddit post about that. All right. Now, again, thank you everyone for being on, and have a great rest of your Saturday, everybody. Take care.